I just completed my LLB at LSE. I graduated a year ago, and afterwards I did an LLM at Harvard Law School. This personal statement structure that we're discussing for UCAS also helped me get offers from Bristol, Warwick, Exeter, and an interview at Oxford. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. In this video, we're going to be talking about the personal statement and the personal statement structure that helped me get offers to law schools. If you're wondering who is she, I just completed my LLB at LSE. I graduated a year ago, and afterwards I did an LLM at Harvard Law School. This personal statement structure that we're discussing for UCAS also helped me get offers from Bristol, Warwick, Exeter, and an interview at Oxford. I also applied for a couple of law with French or law with French law subjects, so I think I know a bit more about blending two slightly different but related subjects in one personal statement. So if you have any questions about that as well, feel free to let me know in the comments below. Yeah, this was an accurate representation of me at the beginning of this process. I hadn't really decided what I wanted to study in year 12. I was kind of between history and French, history and econ, law. At some point I wanted to do English lit. I narrowed it down to two things. It was either I was going to do history or some sort of history and French, or law with French. And basically the process of starting to write my personal statement during year 12 and gathering information and also doing further reading is what really helped me realize what I wanted to study at university. So the point of this slide is just to say, if you feel slightly overwhelmed or like you don't know what's going on yet, that's completely normal. Okay, so let's get started. As you know, UCAS have announced a new structure. In my opinion, I think this is honestly just to help you tailor and structure your personal statement better. So the old system was kind of, you get a character limit, I think it was 4,000 characters, and you can write whatever. There were no questions, no set guidance. Whereas I think this helps you plan out your answer a bit more, and it also means that you can be a lot more focused with what you're writing. Maybe that does limit creativity a tad, but I think there's so much you can still do within this structure. So the new questions: why do you want to study this course or subject? How have your qualifications and studies helped you prepare? And what else have you done to prepare for this course outside of education? And why are these useful? The first question basically says, why this course? So if you're applying for law, why law? My advice for this is be as specific as possible. I think this is something that's been said even with the old UCAS structure. It's not helpful to be super generic. Like, I want to study law because I want to change the world. Demonstrate where your interest in law originated from. For example, for me, during school, I'd done the UK mock trials competition, I think it was called. And it was basically where each school would have teams, maybe teams of one or two, and we would get a fake criminal law case and we would prepare for it during the term, and then at some point we would go like to a local court and have a competition. So that experience was kind of my first exposure to what it might be like to study or in some ways practice law. It's basically an early form of mooting, so I remember speaking about that as where my interest in law originated from. Like I just hinted at, like, it's fine to be personal. So for me it was because I'd done these competitions and I really enjoyed, researching and preparing cross-examinations with my school team and getting to go to court and do all the things. So it's fine to be personal and sort of say where your specific interest came from, but obviously be honest. Don't exaggerate anything. And I think it's super important, especially when you're applying for law, to write clearly. There's a misconception that you have to use like super flowery language, super dramatic structures and idioms. That's not necessary. Just write clearly in a way that whoever's reading your personal statement is able to understand, why does this person want to study law and what have they done so far to help them with that interest. Okay, so I think we have an example from my personal statement here. So I said, witnessing the difference in application of the law in two democratic countries, I became more interested in what the law is in theory and how this translates to society. In addition, the rise of social issues which proved to only be effectively addressed on an international level, as well as my love of the French language, convinced me to study law beyond that of the UK. So this is an excerpt from a paragraph in my personal statement. This is not the full paragraph, but before this, I had basically spoken about where my interest in law came from, and why I wanted to explore the intersection of law and democracy. And then I was also justifying in this part why I was applying for law with French. And like I mentioned, at some universities, I was applying for law with French law. Okay, now the next question, I think this is where it starts to get super, super specific. In my opinion, the first question is just not broad, but why this course or subject allows you to take a whole range of routes. You can talk about a personal encounter with the law if that's what you want to, or something you saw growing up, or an article that you read that first introduced you to the subject. Or like I mentioned, for me, it was UK mock trials competitions when I was in school. The second question is a lot more, how has what you've done so far helped you to prepare for studying law? And this is where I think the new questions in the UCAS structure really help guide your answer. So this is very specific. This isn't what have you done in life that's helped you prepare. This is how have your qualifications or studies so far. So if you've done A levels, explain how those A levels have helped you develop an interest in law. For example, if you did A level history and you study a specific part of history that made you interested in the law around that time or the law related to that country, you can mention that. So this is a content element when you link the content you've learned in a subject to the content of law and how those two relate to each other. So for example, if you did philosophy and as part of your philosophy A level, you studied a bit about the philosophy of law, you can link that to your interest in law and be like, actually, I then started to realize that law and philosophy are quite linked, and this explains why I'd want to study it further at university. Now, if you've done subjects that maybe don't evidently relate to law in terms of their content, so if you did maths, French, physics, that still doesn't mean that you can't apply or apply successfully to study law at university. And that's where the second point, the skills element, is really, really useful. So for example, if you did physics and you gained a lot of analytical skills from that, you can link that to something that's helped you prepare for law school. Maybe you did a physics competition or a project with other teammates, and you can mention that the analytical skills you gain from this will help you when you're analysing case law and linking case law to different like academic arguments as a law student. And so what I would do is I would actually go on the university's website. So if you have a list of universities that you're wanting to apply to, I'd go on their website and have a look at what skills do they say law students need to have. For example, I went to, this is from the LSE Law webpage, and it's from University of Bristol, both universities that I applied to when I was applying. And it says the objectives of the LLB degree are to develop students' analytical and research skills, equipping them with the generic skills they'll need in their future careers. So here we have analytical skills and we have research skills. From Bristol's university website, you graduate with strong legal, analytical, and reasoning skills, ready for success in legal and non-legal sectors. So what I would do from this is, so if I need that, I need to demonstrate analytical and reasoning skills. I would then make a list of those skills on Storm, how I can demonstrate those skills from my studies so far. For example, like we mentioned, reasoning skills. If I did maths, physics, and French at A level, I could link the reasoning skills to either my maths or my French studies. French, like learning a new language and having to sort of memorize different grammar rules, adapt your writing to different contexts. Also, if I did French literature, which I believe you do as part of an A level French, course, I would mention from that what are the reasoning skills that I've gained, how have I learned to analyze the point of different or the purpose of different literary techniques, and how have I learned to do that in a different language, how have I linked the context or the socio-political context of the text I'm studying to the language and to the theme we're discussing in class. These are all examples of you demonstrating reasoning. Here it's helpful to draw on specific things that you've done. The more specific the better. So if you're describing a content link between your A levels or your other qualifications and you wanting to study law, it could be as specific as I looked at this specific topic in history and I found that super interesting, and this sparked an interest in law because why? Or you could also say, well, I did this maths project with this physics project and I had to learn to analyze data in this way and I used these skills. And I think this would be helpful as a law student when I apply my analysis to legal cases and other legal materials. So that's kind of how I would approach question two. As a reminder, you don't need to study law at A level. I don't think most people have, at least from like my friends and people I know who did law with me. It's enough that you can demonstrate how your studies so far have led you to being interested in doing law further at university. I think I also have some slight examples from my personal statement here. So, how have your qualifications helped you prepare for this subject? I should note when I applied for university, it was the old UCAS structure, so it was just like a free writing. It was the free writing model, but these are bits that I've picked out from my personal statement that I think I would have put under this section if I was applying with the current structure. So, in my personal statement, I mentioned my EPQ and I discussed the topic I wrote it on. And this was relevant for two reasons. It was relevant because my EPQ was law related, so I was able to say, well, my EPQ course at A level really helped me prepare for studying law and get interested in law because I was researching this area of law. But also, I mentioned the skills I gained through my EPQ, independent study, research skills, analysis skills, and also just learning to organize my research. And these are all things that I thought would be relevant for studying law at university. So I mentioned both the skills that I gained from the process of doing my EPQ, and I mentioned the topic that I did my EPQ on and how that topic sparked my interest or further helped me get more interested in studying law. I also mentioned the conclusion I came to at the end of my EPQ, and I think it's helpful if you can sort of mention areas where you still find a bit challenging or areas you still have questions in. So there are things that I still wanted to explore further that I hadn't had the chance to do or get answers to during my EPQ, and I mentioned these as areas that I wanted to explore further when I studied law. And then the final question I think is perhaps what people most commonly think of when you think of like what's been a personal statement, because it's super curricular activities. It's what else have you done to prepare outside of education and why are those experiences useful? You could sort of split this into two parts. So you can mention extracurricular things. So I've said here like debating or sports commitments or a part-time job even. Or you can mention super curricular activities. I would personally recommend focusing on the super curricular activities. But like I said, things that don't relate to law in terms of their content, but where you get useful skills from, can still be very, very helpful. So in this paragraph, all you do is you mention some of the things you've done outside of your A-level studies or outside of formal education, and you mention what you've learned from them, why those experiences are useful, and I guess by extension, why those experiences are useful to study law. So in the super curricular section, talking about wider reading, if you went to watch a case in court, what you found enjoyable, what you found difficult about the experience, if you attended a taster lecture on an interesting topic that got you reflecting, or if you did some free online courses on specific areas of law. A website I remember finding really useful was called Cambridge HE Plus, and they had packs of reading on different topics of law, and you can kind of do them, get an insight into the area of law, and it was a good springboard to then find extra reading and further cases maybe to look into. And then once you've done that, of course, don't neglect the second part of the question, which is why these experiences useful or what did you learn? So when you did the free online course on, let's say, I don't know, sports law, were there any questions that you had during the course? Were there any new opinions that you developed, or did you strengthen an existing view, or did you change your mind on something? Or when you did the online course on sports law, did that also remind you of something happening currently in the news, and were you able to link the two together? So it's good to note why those experiences are useful, and I think this is where the reader is able to get a sense of how your experiences translate well into you studying law at university. Some little excerpts from my personal statement that I think I would put under this question or this section if I was applying now. So I said during my unique program, I attended a lecture on civil dispute resolution, which highlighted the practical difficulty in determining whether a judge should be deemed biased or unfit to hear a specific case. So this is just a very short excerpt, but this was at the end of a paragraph. And in this paragraph, or at the start of this paragraph, I discussed a reading that I did on judicial discretion in the law. I also mentioned another lecture on judicial discretion that I had attended and some of the questions that I had from that lecture. And then I mentioned at the end here, I also attended this lecture, and these are my conclusions from it. Here, you can't really, I've done this sort of on purpose, you can't really see the why these experiences useful. This paragraph or this sentence just gives you an idea of what have you done to prepare outside of education. And this is a good start where it says, I've attended a lecture, and that kind of tells the reader that, okay, you've done some work to look into your interest in law, you're perhaps interested in this area. I've also kind of mentioned what I learned, the practical difficulty, but I haven't necessarily said why these experiences are useful. I think that came more at the start of the paragraph. Like I said, this was from the old structure, and I've removed excerpts just to show you examples of what this might look like now. Another paragraph, I think this was at the start. Yeah, this was at the start of a different paragraph. And it said, upon reading Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, I became intrigued by Britain's past of colonization and decided to read a series of articles titled Sociological Approaches to Racism in Britain. I'm pretty sure these articles were actually on the Cambridge HG Plus website that I mentioned. These articles presented race as a social construct, which, along with the belief in the curse of Ham, formed the basis for the justification of the slave trade. This encouraged me to write an essay which won the Merton Law Essay Competition, in which I came to a judgment that Britain owes monetary compensation to the countries exploited during the slave trade. So this is kind of the beginning of, I think this was my penultimate paragraph of my personal statement. And you can see a few things that I've done outside of education here. So I mentioned the book I read, Things Fall Apart, which isn't actually strictly a legal book, it's more socio-historical, but I read this book and I absolutely loved it. And like I said, it did sort of get me thinking about racism and the law. So I read the series of articles on the Cambridge HG Plus website. You can also see that I've entered an essay competition, which again shows a bit of initiative in trying to explore law outside of education and trying to prepare for studying law at university. And then here I've mentioned the judgment or the conclusion I came to in my essay. And then further on, I think I mentioned that the experience from this prepared me for studying law because of, again, gaining independent research skills and being able to formulate my own judgments from a bunch of reading materials. So I think those are some examples of things that you can mention in this section of the personal statement. I think it gives you a lot of latitude in what you can say. And like I mentioned in the past slide, you can also speak of extracurricular things. I don't have an example of that here, but I'm pretty sure I did mention some extracurricular things that I'd done in my last paragraph and why those gave me skills that I thought would be beneficial as a law student. And those skills, I mentioned a mix of things like reasoning and analytical skills, of course, but I also mentioned things like teamwork and just sort of showing that you'd be able to contribute to the life of the university. I don't know if that's as necessary now because, like I said, the new UCAS structure is very specific, the questions are very focused. So I would spend the majority of your time just directly answering the question, what have you done to prepare outside of education and why these experiences are useful? Just to sort of sum up everything we've discussed, a personal statement should be personal. Perhaps it's better to say it should be personalized, in the sense that it should really tell your story of why you want to study that subject. And obviously, by your story, I don't necessarily mean that you have to go into your life story. You just have to tell your story with that subject. So, when did you first encounter it? How have your A levels or your studies so far helped you to study that course at university? And then, what else have you done outside of your formal A levels or other qualifications to prepare for studying this subject? What else have you done to enhance your interest? it should be clear. Especially if you're applying for things like history, law, clarity is super important. But honestly, for any subject that you're applying for, your personal statement should be clear. It should be honest. I think this kind of goes with the personal element. I think sometimes there's pressure because people say like your personal statement should be super personal, to maybe like fabricate or exaggerate things. You're not expected to have won a Nobel Prize before you go to university. I think you can just be honest with your experiences so far and what you've done. And as long as, like I said, you can clearly link that to what you want to study at university, I think you'll be fine. They should absolutely be substantiated with evidence. So if you're going to say, I think I have strong analytical skills to be a law student, it helps to have evidence. So whether that's an essay competition that you wrote and a conclusion that you came to, or an EPQ that you did, and you being able to show the analysis that you did during that EPQ. I should say an EPQ is an extended project qualification. So it's essentially an extended essay that you do at A level if you opt to take one. And lastly, it should absolutely be tailored to the question. I think one of the main reasons why we have the new structure and three questions is to ensure that students can write really focused answers. So that is everything on how I would approach writing a personal statement. Now, if you guys do have any questions or want me to go in depth in any specific areas, let me know. Just as a final note, I think you should absolutely enjoy the process of writing your personal statement. This is not to say that it'll be the smoothest or easiest process. But if you're absolutely hating everything about what you're writing, I would maybe rethink whether that's a subject you want to do. Like I mentioned, I was a bit undecided in year 12, and I actually started writing a personal statement both for history and French and for law. And it only became clear whilst I was writing the personal statements that I wanted to study law, because when I was amalgamating all the evidence I had and all the extracurricular and supercurricular things I'd done, and also when I was just writing about what I learned from these experiences, it was so clear to me that I'd enjoyed all the stuff I'd done related to law. And that is everything for this video. Good luck, happy reading, happy exploring, happy writing. I hope it goes well. And like I mentioned earlier, if you guys do have any more questions about personal statements, or things related to like wider reading and how to get experience for applying for law school, do let me know, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.